We are back. Twins, Senators, Rangers and Expos too. Past, present, and future. A podcast meant for you. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The co-hosts of the show are Ron Rabinovitz and George Carl. I said that last week too. George, how many people say that to you? George Case III.
How you doing, Ralph?
Welcome back, guys. Sorry I messed it up, George. I'm an old guy.
That's all right. No problem. Just don't call me late for dinner. That's all.
I won't. As a matter of fact, George Carl, you should be complimented. I think he's arguably the best coach in the NBA over the years. Anyway, he's just terrific. No time for that today. We have a terrific guest. He's an author, wrote a book on Tony Pedro Oliva. We'll explain the Pedro part. And he's also an editor with a periodical that filled our youth, Ron and I, and I'm sure George enjoyed Baseball Digest as well. He's Thom Henninger, and first time in the zone. Welcome, my friend.
Oh, welcome, gentlemen. Glad to be here.
Looking forward to hearing your stories about Tony Oliva, Tom. Thank you very much. We're as I mentioned to you before we got on the air, my dad was the Twins' third base coach in 1968, and one of my earliest memories from that was my dad talking about the greatness of Tony Oliva.
Well, he was there for his prime years, too. Those were wonderful years for Tony.
It sure was. He was great.
Yeah. Tom, how'd you get interested in Tony Oliva? How did it get to the point where you wrote a book? And let's start with that.
Well, I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was home for me. The Twins came to town when I was 7. They made the franchise move when I was a young kid, and became very attached to the guys like Killebrew and Oliva, and I was a left-hander, so I certainly took an interest in Oliva, and as I got older, I discovered some facts about his life and really decided I wanted to pursue a book. I came to realize that if it wasn't for the Bay of Pigs invasion, he may never well have had a major league career. Just an interesting twist of fate how he ended up, sticking around and having a career in the United States.
Whoa, let's talk about that a little bit. I have an affinity with Cuba. When my father escaped the Nazis and emigrated here, he couldn't get into the United States. He went through Cuba first, and he had to spend a lot of time in Cuba before he can get to the United States. So I've always had a great affinity for Cuban players, Manny Minoso, and it goes back further than that. But how did the Bay of Pigs affect Tony getting here?
Well, Tony was coming over with 21 other prospects, all Cuban kids, in April of '61. I think probably about the time he was getting on the plane, the Bay of Pigs invasion was being planned, and it took place while he was flying over, making his way. What in essence happened is this group of 22 kids were going to go to Mexico City to work out visas. They were going to have 2 weeks in the United States. Because of the failing relations between the two countries, it took 11 days to get those visas. So leaving these kids arrive in camp, and they've got 3 days to impress. Well, Oliva goes 7 for 10 in the last 3 exhibition games, but he's so raw defensively. He's had so little coaching that he can hardly get his hand on a fly ball. And in essence, after the 3 days, the Twins decide they're going to send him home and cut him. Well, by then, the events of the Bay of Pigs invasion had taken place and all but shutting down Cuba, and Tony was waiting for his visa to go home, and in essence, it never came. And in the meantime, the Twins gave him another chance. He went to rookie ball and batted .410 that summer, so he pretty much sealed his fate and managed to stay because of the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Wow, that's so interesting. Do you still live in the Twin Cities, Tom?
No, I live in Chicago. Baseball Digest is based here in Chicago, and
I live
Minnesota in the late 70s. You live in Minneapolis?
Minneapolis, yeah. And I'm friends with Tony also. He's quite a guy, wonderful guy, wonderful man.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's an icon there, isn't he?
Great ambassador for the Twins.
Absolutely.
What with the early passing of three of the great, when I think about it, just now, Bob Allison, Harmon Killebrew, Rod Carew is very, very ill from what I understand.
Yeah, he is. He's doing better, though, thank God.
Of course, the tragic death of Kirby Puckett, who died so young. There aren't many spokesmen for the Twins, and he is certainly that. What a gentleman he is. Tom, let me skip around a little bit and ask you whether or not you became a journalist first or a sports journalist. Was it just journalism first, or sports journalism that got you into it? Was it your sports that made you decide to become a journalist? That was so well said, Ralph.
No, it wasn't. Sports
I'll
wasn't.
have to put that on a promo when I put it out. Do you get the essence of that, Tom, or should I just...
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The sports did not come first. Well, in fact, I started journalism in a photo department and found out I didn't really like the darkroom that much, so I switched to writing. I thought I was much more interested in third world issues, poverty issues, world poverty, and what I really found out is I couldn't get myself published without a master's in public health, and I dabbled around with writing about different subjects, and in essence, I kind of fell back onto something I knew and kind of struck it well. I worked for Stats Inc. for 17 years, and it was in those years that I kind of established myself.
Well, I'm going to do a show later on this evening on fantasy baseball, and Stats Inc. in the early days of fantasy baseball had a thing going. I can't remember who they were hooked up with, but I used to play fantasy baseball, and Stats Inc. had a lot to do with it. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Well, they did their own simulation leagues where you could, computers would play games involving stars from all eras, but
that must have been it. Yes, absolutely.
That's kind of where they started. Yeah.
Yes, you could. You basically had a budget, and one could draft a team, and I did for a year or two, and they would play simulated games. It was back before everybody had a computer, so what they do, you get an envelope with the stats and the recaps every week of the teams that you picked. And for instance, you could have you just fill your budget with the players that you liked. And if you choose carefully, you do very well, because the way the simulations were, played some excellent recreations of statistics and probabilities. You had an injury factor with players. It came into their overall price, whether or not they stayed healthy. It was really well done, and if you had a big part in that, I'd like to thank you.
I sure did. In fact, you got those newsletters every week. I think you played 11 games in a week for 14 weeks, if I recall, and each week you would get a newsletter, and it would have highlights from that week's action. I wrote those newsletters. We would spend one day a week literally writing newsletters for all the leagues over an entire day. It was usually a 10-hour day, but, you were writing about Babe Ruth's Grand Slam that drove in, Greg Nettles.
Exactly.
Or, it was, they were a lot of fun.
You go page by page, the way it was arranged. You read the Monday's game first, Tuesday's game, and it's almost like it was a prelude, I guess, to fantasy baseball as we know it today, or at least a different essence of it. And So I thank you for that. Let's get to Tony a little bit. What are the things that we don't know about Tony Oliva that I thought my main trivia question was, he was named after his brother. Was it his brother that he was named after? If I'm not mistaken, he used the name Pedro. How did that come about?
Well, Pedro was his given name. He was the first son, and he was named after his father. Tony was his brother 3 years younger, and in essence, when it came time to get a passport to come over, I get the impression Tony was not born in a hospital. There was no official birth certificate, so he used his brother Tony's. And this is something actually Tony was one of the few subjects Tony refused to talk about with me. His wife leaked a little information on it, and I found out a little more later elsewhere. But Tony wouldn't talk about it. You know, it was commonly done in those days. Papa Joe Cambria, the well-known scout in Cuba, pretty much facilitated all these signings. He worked exclusively for the Griffith family, and I think Cambria was probably behind getting younger ages attached to players, to Latin American players, and which was very common in those days.
Well, I happen to have written on a manila folder an autograph that Tony signed for me, signed Pedro Oliva. He signed it in Visalia when he was a rover for them, and I was the Tops rep. And I don't think he has a complete understanding of English humor, American humor, but I kind of kidded him about that, and he just let me, he just smiled and signed it, Pedro Oliva. So, Pedro Oliva. I didn't realize his brother was younger. So, is it the age that he represented that you think he's reluctant to talk about?
I don't really know why. I mean, I think the story's out there, people know, and commonly it's just more of a flagrant lie where they'll, a scout will literally change the age on paperwork, but in this case he just basically followed the letter of the law. He was using his brother's passport and he used his brother's year, so it was a little less deliberate. He had virtually nothing to do with it. I'm sure it was done by Cambria and dealing with legal channels in Cuba. So I'm not sure why he's never wanted to talk about it. He's open about virtually everything else, but this was one thing off limits.
Back in Cuba that he was estranged from during his career?
Anyone in Cuba? No. He was. I'm sorry.
Did he leave family in Cuba that he was estranged from during his career?
No. He, he didn't see his parents for a decade after he left by virtue of what happened. But a very tight-knit family. There were 10 kids. They grew up on a farm together. He was very homesick for a number of years. He was very good at compartmentalizing it and keeping it from affecting his game to a point where his teammates didn't even know the pain he was going through. He was just a rural kid, grew up on a small farm away from everything. He wasn't anywhere near Havana. He was not a big city kid at all, and it was an extremely tough adjustment. And they remain close. He goes back, at least once a year now. His parents are gone, of course, and a few of his siblings, but he's extremely close to family. When they go to Cuba, they don't do touristy things. They go see the family out in the western part of Cuba.
When I meant estranged, I meant physically estranged, not estranged.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, he was very, very much physically estranged. It was almost a decade before some of the players managed to go back. Longer for most of the guys. In fact, most cases, the family came over for a visit. That seemed to be easier to facilitate. And Tony met up with his mother in Mexico when he played winter ball after the 70 season. And of course, he'd come here in April of '61, so it'd been almost a decade. And then the next winter, his dad came over, and so he saw his dad for the first time. And he was a little luckier there than some of the other guys. A lot of those guys from that era never saw their parents again. So their parents passed away in that time before they could reunite.
Tony and I have been friends for a long time, and matter of fact, we have the same accountant. But he does so many wonderful things for kids. He's great with kids. I do a charity. It's called Create a Memory every year at the ballpark for underprivileged kids. And Tony's always involved. He wants to be there and help and everything. So we were standing when we were doing it at the Metrodome first when the Twins were there, and these kids got to run the bases and many other things that they could do, and they gave them food and they pitched. It was thrilling. So we still do it now. It's over at Target Field. But I'm standing with Tony one day at the Metrodome, and he says to me, Ronnie, he says, if I ever played here in this dome, I'd have hit more home runs than Babe Ruth. And then he chuckled. Yeah.
I will always think of him with a smile on his face. He just loved baseball.
Always.
And he had that gold tooth that stood out.
Yep, that's right.
Part of that big smile. Yeah.
Yes. Anything we don't know about? How about George? George, did your dad pass on any stories to you about being Tony's teammate?
Well, you know what, with Tony being with the Twins, that when my dad was there in '68, they just had an injury jinx, and Tony had been hurt quite a bit. Harmon Killebrew only played, I think, 100 games. He had a terrible hamstring injury, and the Twins just did not have a good year. They had a great team, great players, but had a bad year because of the injury factor. Now, Thom also mentioned one person that I had a very close knowledge of, and that was Joe Cambria, because Joe Cambria had signed my dad. And Joe Cambria was the super scout and brought a lot of the Cuban players for Mr. Griffith into Washington to play. But Joe Cambria also signed quite a few American players, my dad, Early Wynn, Eddie Yost, and several others. So when Thom mentioned Joe Cambria and Tony Oliva, that was certainly a name that was very familiar to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was quite a guy, wasn't he?
Do any of you, when the name Eddie Yost is mentioned, not think of the walking man?
I certainly do, Ralph.
Yeah.
My dad and Eddie Yost were very good friends, and Eddie, I happened to see him probably, 10, 15, 20 years ago at a Washington Senators reunion, and we had a nice visit and a lot of talking about the old times, and that was Eddie Yost. He was known as the walking man, and what
How
you may
did he
not
get that
know,
name, George? Do you have any idea?
Was
it just he walked a lot?
Well, yeah, that was it. He had a very good eye, and the pitchers a lot of times would get into a 3-2 count and so forth, and ball four would come in and Eddie would walk, so they would call him the walking man. And the thing I was started to mention was that Eddie was the one-game interim manager of the Washington Senators. Mickey Vernon was let go. Gil Hodges was brought in, and in the interim, Eddie Yost was there for one game. So on his stat sheet, you might see his managerial stat of one game as the manager of the Washington.
One game.
Whoa. I happen to know that Gil Hodges was traded for Bill Dennehy.
Really? Bill Dennehy.
Washington team. And that's what gave the Washington, came from the Mets to manage Washington. And then, obviously, or ironically, or whatever, went on to manage the Mets after he became experienced.
Well, Gil took over the Washington Ball Club, and they didn't have any talent. And a couple of years later, he wound up becoming the Mets manager. In '69, the Miracle Mets, winning the World Series.
Absolutely,
that's right.
And then came Ted Williams to follow Gil, which
Ted Williams came on in '69, and that was the only winning season Washington had, and up until the current with the Nationals. But Ted Williams was there in Washington at the same time that Vince Lombardi was the coach of the Washington Redskins. So there they had two great personalities, both in Washington, managing and coaching at the same time.
Huh. Wow. That's very interesting. Tom,
hey,
Tom, are you still there? I was very close friends with Jackie Robinson. We were very dear friends. And Tony knew about that. I told Tony about stories about Jackie. And they related a lot because in similarity, they had similar things because Jackie he was very lonely at the time when he first broke into baseball. And Tony was also lonely, homesick and lonely as a Cuban, coming over here. And he could relate to some of the things that Jackie went through, certainly not in the degree that he did, but we talked about it extensively.
Mm-hmm. Tom, who were the players that gave Tony a hard time when he got here, and who were the players that helped him?
One thing it's hard to get Tony to say a bad thing about anyone, which is a wonderful trait.
Right.
And
that's right.
I really didn't get a response on that end about getting trouble. He didn't even want to really talk about any racial issue him and his South Dakota farm girl wife endured. He's very upbeat and refuses to talk about negatives much, but he does credit a lot of players for being a big help. The minor league years were a little more lonely, but when he joined the Twins, suddenly he had Camilo Pascual, he had Pedro Ramos, Oliva, Sandy Valdespino. There was a core of other Cubans around, and Valdespino came a year later than he did, but suddenly there were a lot of Spanish speakers, and he also credits Earl Batty, who was a Spanish-speaking, person on the team as well as a catcher, which is a great help to Pascual and Ramos. And he credits Jim Cott for being very friendly and open, and the sluggers as well, Jim Lemon and Killebrew. Oliva joined the team at the end of '61. He was not put on the roster, but they had him travel with the team in September or be with the team in September just to get oriented to the big city and the major league scene. And he speaks of those people really stepping up. Some of those guys weren't around by the time he arrived as a rookie, but Lemon was on that team and Ramos, and he credits all those guys for being quite helpful when he first arrived.
Well, he's so fortunate. If he was going to play in the Midwest, to play in Minneapolis, Wisconsin is a liberal state in the Midwest, which is an anomaly. Did that have anything to do with the move that George can address this from Washington to Minnesota? The makeup of the team was so Latin. Did Mr. Griffith make sure that those players would be accepted? Did that enter his mind, do you suppose?
Well, you know what, Ralph, I can't really speak about that personally, but I do know that, when Calvin moved the club, the move was made because it was in a very difficult neighborhood for Griffith Stadium, and Calvin was given a tremendous offer by Minnesota to move the club. And there were numerous Cuban players on Washington during the time my dad played as well as later. So, and they did not have really black players per se, African Americans that we speak of today, but they had a lot of dark-skinned Cubans. So, the fact that the move was made to Minneapolis, it was a terrific move for the Twins. And then when they made the move, part of that was the fact that Calvin had gotten the agreement from Major League Baseball to make sure that there was a Major League team in Washington. So that's how the expansion centers were born when the Twins moved to Minneapolis, and then, Washington had the expansion team. So there was not a tremendous amount of, thinking about the color of the skin, but it was the ability, and the Twins had some great players. And then, unfortunately, with the expansion centers, the talent was really lacking. So the Washington fans were used to, seeing the team on an upswing with the great players like Killebrew and Allison and Roy Sievers and Jim Lemon. hitting home runs at Griffith Stadium, and all of a sudden now they've got a new team with players they didn't even know who half the players were. So, but the move was good for Minnesota, and it turned out long term it was great for Washington because they still had a Major League ball club.
Yeah, and Tony really talks about him and his wife really not encountering many issues, in public places, whether they went to a movie theater or went out to eat. They just did tend to find this Twin Cities very accepting. And Vic Power used to talk about that. He was a very colorful character in town, and he was just beloved by everyone, and his one-handed scoops and his blowing big bubbles on the field. And Power used to say neighbors invited him and his family into their homes for meals. He just loved it there, and he planned on retiring there. And unfortunately, the Twins traded him, and he moved on. But it wasn't a very liberal town in a lot of ways.
Very much so. It was a very liberal, Hubert Humphrey town.
Vic Power's a great story. He was a Yankee prospect coming up, and he was married to a Puerto Rican woman, and a Puerto Rican, light-skinned Puerto Rican. I think that's what the issue was with the Yankees. And for years they would, Ron and I talked about Suitcase Simpson, Harry Suitcase Simpson. He was one of those prospects too, and he was so much less talented than Power, and he came up, and they would never bring up Vic Power. They ended up trading him to Kansas City, and he not only was he a terrific player with Minnesota, he was on that 59 Cleveland team that came so close to beating the White Sox and the Yankees that year. So he had a terrific career as well. Anything you can tell us as I skip around trying to get to the current Twins? Tom, do you have a take on what's going on? They're off to a 4-1 start. They're
in first place. They're in first place,
yeah.
For now.
For now.
It's early, Ron.
That's right. It's early. That's right.
Yeah, considerably early. But do you have a take on whether or not there's a possibility of them being really competitive this year?
I suspect it's a little early, especially after what happened last year. They flirted with a division, a division tie or a wild card spot the year before, and then last year it fell apart and lost 103 games. And I think we're really at a point where we've got to see whether all these young kids are going to pan out. Rosario, Santana,
right.
Sano, I think looks a little more assured, but. Well, even Buxton is a little bit of a question mark yet. And this is probably a huge year in determining whether this core they've developed is really a core to win or is this something that, 2 years from now they're going to be rebuilding again. And I certainly hope that's not the case. But it's a big year for a lot of those young guys.
It is. And I think it's a rebuilding year. They're not going to be in first place very long. But I think that they're rebuilding. And I think the general manager and his sidekick are terrific. Thad Levine and I forget the other fellows. One's from Texas and one's from Cleveland. So they have
Belvey is the other guy.
Yeah, right. So they know about winning, and I think they're going to bring some good blood to the Twins. As I say, I think it's a year of growing and learning, and I think pitching's still going to be an issue for them, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think until they get a couple more starters that can, really stick it out for a season and be consistent pitchers,
right.
I think they're going to be away. They're not going to contend, but our Hughes might be better this year. Gibson looks like he'll be better this year, but there's still 2 or 3 spots in that rotation that look pretty iffy for now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have a feeling Dozier won't be there for the whole year either. There's still rumors about that, but we'll see. Yeah.
Very interesting.
About what? I'm sorry, I missed that.
About Dozier. there's still rumors that he might be traded before the, by the 31st of July. That July deadline.
I think they're waiting for someone to overpay for him.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's hope it happens.
Okay, guys, this
year.
has been terrific. Tom, I hope you come back. And before you go, tell us where we can get the book on Tony, and tell us if you have a project coming up.
Oh, sure.
If you have anything going that you want to tell us about.
Yeah, well, the Tony book came out in April of 15, April of 15, yes. So it's been out a while, and it's a bit run its course as far as just walking into a bookstore and finding it, but unless you know a bookstore with a big sports section. But it can obviously be ordered from, independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, that sort of thing. And while I was writing it, I also had long narratives about the Twins pennant races in those years. The Twins had great races in 65, 67, 69, and 70, and the editor convinced me that those narratives were taking away from Tony's story. So I have a second book that I just finished. I don't have it signed yet to a publisher, but it's addressing those pennant races and what the Twins did in those four big seasons. And I integrate the pop culture, history, and a little Vietnam, little British invasion, civil rights movement. It's a little broader than a baseball book, actually, but at the core of it are those four pennant races the Twins were in.
Fabulous.
It sounds to me like the book is written with the flavor of my favorite all-time baseball book. It's called Willie's Time. And it's more so a reflection of what was going on during Willie's playing time. Chapters go by the presidents that I think Hoover was president when he was born, and all the way through Lyndon Johnson in his playing career. And I think your book is, the way you describe it, is along those lines. Am I right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, definitely. I don't, I guess I address Johnson and Nixon, quite vividly. That they were at the core of the story, the political events of those days. So, but yeah, I think that it's probably quite true. And, it was an exciting time. The Beatles arrived.
Wait to read it. It's got to be incredibly interesting.
What's the title of the book, Tom?
I'm calling it The Glory Years of the Minnesota Twins. What's the subtitle? I've got Rock and Roll, War and Peace, the Civil Rights Movement in Baseball in the 1960s. So,
fabulous.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if it'll end up with that title when it... I'm sorry?
You still get to the Twin Cities once in a while?
Yeah, I do a lot. I still have family there. Actually, Tony's... I'm sorry?
I'd love to get together and have lunch with you sometime.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
Sure. Why don't we share information? I'll pass on through Ralph. And
okay.
But I do go up there a lot. In fact, when I did the book, I couldn't really. I had trouble with Tony's English, which I think George you'd be well aware of. And if I wasn't face to face with him, I didn't hear him very well. So I went up there 7-8 times a year and sat down with Tony for 3-4 years before the book was done. So. And then there's family too.
Does Tony have children?
Yes, he has 3 children. They all live within about 10 miles. It's a very tight family. They live within, 10 minutes, of Tony and his wife. And there's a few grandchildren. There was number 5 or 6th grandchild was just born a year or 2 ago. And a very tight family. And two sons and a daughter. He had one son that was a prospect that eventually was injured. It sounded like he had kind of the natural hitting ability that his father had, but somewhere along the line he suffered an injury before he. I don't even know if he was drafted or if he suffered an injury fairly young. I understand. So, and one of his children, the other son, is a professional musician, a well-known musician around town. So,
he's quite a guy. He's got such a good sense of humor, and the things he does with youth and kids, it's terrific. He's really a great asset.
He's got a spirit that transcends
terrific.
whether or not the words. In other words, you may not be able to understand everything he says, but you can tell he's a warm, gentle man. And
very positive, very positive. No negativity at all. He's just a great guy.
Yeah.
Hey, Thom, I hope you'll come back often and visit with us and keep us posted as to when you get your book published, and we'll keep up with you.
Okay, well, wonderful.
Thom,
I'd enjoy coming back.
Give Ralph your information, and I'll get in touch with you, and I'd love to have lunch with you.
Befriend each other on Facebook.
That's right.
Okay, I've enjoyed it, Thom. Best of luck with your book, and I really enjoyed hearing you talk about Tony Oliva.
Oh, thanks. No, glad to come aboard.
Thanks, Thom.
Hey, thank you, gentlemen. It was fun, enjoyable, and we'll do it same time, same bat channel, as Al Blumpkin would say. And we'll catch you guys next week.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, and keep on keeping on.
Hello?